C'est bon. Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Foucault 713. So halfway, past halfway. Foucault 1313, Security, Territory, Population, the 13 lectures that Michel Foucault taught after his one and only sabbatical year between January 11th and April 5th of 1978. After considering the different regulations and practices regarding leprosy in the Middle Ages, plague between the Middle Ages and the early modern period, and smallpox from the 19th century onwards, Foucault underscores his previous idea that law, discipline, and security are not in a historical succession, but that security is a way of making the old armatures of law and discipline function in addition to the specific mechanisms of security. He then says, what is involved is the emergence of technologies of security within mechanisms that are either specifically mechanisms of social control, as in the case of the penal system, or mechanisms with the function of modifying something in the biological destiny of the species. Can we say, then, and this is what is at stake in what I want to analyze, that the general economy of power in our societies is becoming a domain of security? Foucault delves into the multiplicities regarding the construction of the domain of security. He then discusses biopolitics and disciplinary power in order to get to a series of definitions of other concepts that will mark his future research as well. Government, whose multiplicity he defines on February 1st, and governmentality that he starts modeling and playing with from that moment onwards. These two concepts are not just important in the lectures themselves, although they receive different degrees of attention. They're important as well because they are in close dialogue with something we cannot see in these lectures, the parallel seminars he was keeping with some of his students, like the one regarding smallpox, and the fact that some other students were at the time working on developing some of the ideas and questions raised by Foucault during the lectures. It's no secret, for instance, that these lectures, and in particular the others about the government of oneself and the others, were crucial for the research projects developed afterwards by Michel Foucault, Pierre-François Moreau, and other researchers that ended up constituting a group at the École Normale Supérieure, first at Fontenay-aux-Roses and now at Lyon. This is quite important. Security, Territory, Population is not properly a book, and it definitely does not solve, does not even pursue some of the questions it raises. It is a seminar, a sitting bed of ideas, some that will bloom in the future, some that will wither. Our seminar is also a way to understand or to pursue the interests of developing, using, and submitting to critique some of these ideas. For a medievalist like me, security offers an enormous critical field to begin a complex critique of the concept of government, and in particular of the pastoral models, or even his research into the raison d'etat. In order to comment, to criticize, and to study some of the main questions in security, we invited today a group of remarkable guests. As you know, we would love to be introducing now Seyla Ben Habib of Yale University, but unfortunately she is headed to Berlin and she couldn't come. Professor Ben Habib, however, will be a senior scholar in residence at the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought for the full spring semester. We would also like to introduce, as a guest, Lisa Duggan of New York University, who was also originally going to join this panel, but her sabbatical research has taken her out of town. We are missing these two fantastic colleagues. Luckily, we will accompany tonight by three wonderful colleagues. David Armitage, the Lloyd Blankfein Professor of History. Sorry? The Lloyd Blankfein Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History at Harvard University, where he teaches intellectual history and international history. Among his many publications, I just want to mention some of his last books, Foundations of Modern International Thought, and the History Manifesto, co-authored with Joe Goldie, as well as his forthcoming Civil War, A History in Ideas. Adam Tooze, Catherine Shelby Colin Davis Professor of History and Director of the European Institute. His most recent book, The Deluge, The Great War, America and the Remaking of the Global Order, won the 2015 Los Angeles Book Prize for History. He has also edited the third volume of the Cambridge History of the Second World War. And Jeremy Kessler, Associate Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. His book, Fortress of Liberty, The Rise and Fall of the Draft and Remaking of American Law, is forthcoming from Harvard. His past scholarship has investigated the origins of modern First Amendment law, the transatlantic debate over the relationship between rights and governance during the Second World War, and, that touches me very deeply, the history of the human right of conscientious objection. And then Bernard Harcourt will begin the discussion afterwards. Please join me in welcoming our guests. David Armitage.
I will not begin at the beginning. I will begin at the end, or after the end. And I will begin actually with another beginning, the beginning of the birth of biopolitics. This is strategic both because I want to work backwards from where Foucault is going to go after the work that we have before us today, security, territory, population, but also because I have some sense of what Adam and Jeremy will talk about, which is where Foucault came from to reach STP, as I suspect we will call it from now on. As you'll recall, or as you will recall probably in the new year when you get to the birth of biopolitics, Foucault begins that work by, as so often, disclaiming historicism. In this case, not simply historicism in the sense of causation and his well-known and frequently remarked allergy to causation, not disclaiming an ambivalent attachment to what he there calls marvellously the great, tender, and warm Freemasonry of useless erudition. Sign me up as a Mason in that lodge. But rather, in this case, his disavowal of historicism in the sense of his desire, as he puts it, to run universals through the grinder of practice. Not to run them through the grinder of practice, but to imagine a thought experiment, imagine a world without universals, as he puts it early in the birth of biopolitics. What if universals, the state, society, sovereign, subjects, do not exist? We might say, of course, that STP, the entire project of that work of security, territory, population, is to show precisely how all four of those universals came to exist, even before he makes them disappear in a puff of blue smoke at the beginning of the birth of biopolitics. That is, STP shows us how state, society, sovereign, subjects, security, territory, perhaps a little less so, population, came into existence. How they came into existence, along what timeline, not necessarily why they came into existence, but also to some extent where they came into existence. And I shall come back to that in a moment to put a little of a spotlight on Foucault's interest in space, which emerges, I think, centrally in this text, and perhaps also to account very briefly for why he should be interested at this point in his unfolding project in space, the spatial location, the spatial dimensions of these otherwise unlocated universals. He's reluctant, of course, throughout STP as elsewhere, to show why these universals came into being, but he does give us some testable hypotheses about the places, the spaces, the times, perhaps even some of the impetuses behind their emergence. How, for instance, security emerges out of safety, sécurité out of sûreté, where territory comes from. And we might need to fill in some of his picture of that. He's not very specific about the timeline of territory, though territory is central to the title, central, of course, to many of the procedures that he's going to deal with under the sign of governmentality. In some sense, territory is the tertium quid of this particular document, a missing or inadequately elaborated feature of the text that we might want to help Foucault fill in retrospectively. And of course, he shows us where population emerges from, how it emerges gradually, but again, somewhat spectrally in its forms. We have a sense of some of its features, but not of its entire physiognomy. Within the unfolding project of the lectures, and here this I will enter into a debate that Adam and Jeremy have already opened up on the blog, and I think will come up in our discussions as well, I think I would discern an obvious break between what came before society, territory, population, and what we have before us today. That is a break between society must be defended across the hiatus or the lacuna of his sabbatical and where he picks up again in STP. Of course, early in society must be defended, Foucault had seen his concerns shifting towards a new long-term or at least medium-term research program, as he says early in that work. Until now, it has been disciplines. For the next 5 years, he's saying this in 1975, of course, for the next 5 years, it will be war, struggle, the army. These will be his concerns. That was 1975. This is now, or rather this is 1977 to 78. And in security, territory, population, I think as others have pointed out, Partha Chatterjee also noted this in some of his remarks on in an earlier iteration of these seminars, we're in the midst of a very different set of concerns from which war and struggle are almost entirely gone. The army, of course, makes fleeting appearances in STP, but instead we have something, again, more spectral than the concerns of war and struggle, the military diplomatic apparatus, as he calls it here. One tiny index, but I think a revealing one, of Foucault's retreat from war and struggle as the central concern which he mapped out as an ongoing program, perhaps even as far as 1980 from his moment in 1975, is his aphoristic revision of Clausewitz, at least twice, by my count, in Society Must Be Defended. He artfully reverses Clausewitz, of course, and talks about politics as, quotes, the continuation of war by other means, and uses that to hang important parts of his discussion upon in that earlier work, in at least the early lectures in 1975-76. By the time we get to STP, when Clausewitz is invoked, he's once again the straight man, the man who tells us that not that politics is the continuation of war, but of course that war is the continuation of politics, as if that fruitful reversal had now been forgotten or had been reversed as a reversal in its turn. Gone again are civil war, the race war, the other internalizations of external struggle. In their place and emerging slowly and deliberately across society, territory, population are, of course, the mechanisms of governmentality, that ugly word, as Foucault teasingly calls it. Foucault, I think, in that sense, has therefore exited one set of framing concerns, stepped outside the program he'd at least projected and followed through to some extent in 1975 to 76. As Adams noted in his extensive blog post already on these matters, Foucault's characteristic maneuver here as elsewhere is what he calls stepping outside philosophy in a very broad sense, more specifically stepping outside different fields, stepping outside of psychiatry to look at the process of segregation, as he says, stepping outside the penal system, again these are all from early in STP, stepping outside the penal system to look at discipline, stepping outside medical institutions into the examination of biopolitics, and now stepping outside the state to examine governmentality, to give us, in some sense, an anatomy of that cold monster, the state, as he puts it twice, again, I think by my count, invoking Nietzsche, his aphoristic view of the state in this particular text. I'd like to pick up just two elements of that stepping outside in this text and briefly juxtapose them with some parallel discussions from the 1970s in a very different, non-coincident sphere, the Anglosphere, which might help us to frame some of Foucault's concerns in a broader context. The two concerns are, to put them in the broadest possible way, space and time. I've already mentioned very briefly that there seems to be some more pointed concentration on space and the spatialization of concepts and practices and the universals that inform and shape them in this particular text. From the opening discussion of the planned towns of 17th century France through to the concluding pages where he talks about the so-called urbanization of the territory, making the kingdom, the entire territory, into one big town. We're meant to remember back to the very first lecture in that, I think that's from the last lecture, what procedures were in place to create, to shape, to form the town, its boundaries, its borders, what moved in, what moved out, what was contained within it, who was contained within it, how those who were contained within it were imagined, controlled, governed, and then to scale that up to the level of the entire kingdom, for instance. So there's a spatial dimension here, which might be, I'm not entirely clear from a couple of readings of the text, it might be what he means by territory in that sense. Are they homologous with each other, this spatialization through the model of the town? Is that what he means by territory? I'm not entirely clear about that and would like elucidation or discussion perhaps of that as well. He's isolating the various spaces of government, the very spaces of governmentality, the objects of security, the containers of population, again scaling up from towns to kingdoms, but bounded kingdoms. Where does this interest in space come from, though? Why does that seem to have particular resonance? Of course, it's not remotely unprecedented in the early lectures, but I think there is a pointedness to it here. One possibility is a 1976 encounter, that is, I think, during the intermitting year, that he had with a group of radical geographers, an absolutely hilarious interview, where the geographers try to persuade Foucault that he's always been really interested in geography. And he resists and said, no, I've never had any interest in geography. I've had about as much interest in geography as I have in biochemistry. Really. I just don't see why it would matter. And they keep coming back 7 or 8 times to persuade him, really, he's a radical geographer and always has been. And at the end, politely, he says, well, maybe you're onto something. Maybe there's something about space that I have been thinking about for some time. And maybe it goes beyond the purely metaphorical. They prod him on his metaphors of space and field and domain and so on. He says, no, they're not metaphors. They actually arise from very important discussions. They're not metaphorical. You really don't understand. But then he does meditate very briefly, I think very interestingly, on why space had been sidelined from many fields, except from geography, and talks there about space as being treated as, quotes, the dead, the fixed, the undialectical, the immobile, in contrast to time for so many disciplines, which he talked of in terms of its richness, its fecundity, its life, its dialectic. So in STP, we see that the disciplinary, what he calls the disciplinary treatment of multiplicities in space, classically or perhaps centrally, populations, is the feature which parallels here, security being the form of government over populations, paralleling discipline over bodies, for instance, but in this case exercised by sovereigns over territories, so spatialized in that sense. What is the role of space in the unfolding account here in Foucault's unfolding account of emergent universals of security, territory, again that central, perhaps hinge concept, population? Is territory effaced or assumed in his arguments? Can we, to follow one of his own thought experiments, imagine space away from his account in society, territory, population, and find his larger argument untouched or unchanged? And then just to pivot very briefly to the second of my interests here, what work does similar gestures towards time do in this text, in framing his examination, his excavation, his genealogy of governmentality, in particular out of the pastorate? Central to Foucault's account here in this text of the emergence of secular governmentality, of course, is his genealogy through the Eastern and Christian, not the Greek, not the Roman, crucially, pastorate in the early modern period into what he calls, quotes, a new historical and political temporality, an open historicity. Of course, a non-eschatological time, without direction, without teleology, therefore opening up a space for, in particular, and I think, again, only intermittently but very suggestively, a space for interstate, international interaction, as he puts it, from the rivalry of princes to the competition of states, which he calls undoubtedly one of the most fundamental mutations in both the form of Western political life and the form of Western history. What might we compare this with? Again, I'm going to break out of the Foucauldian unfolding narrative just to look sideways very briefly into the Anglosphere. Foucault is giving these lectures in 1976 to 77. If we think of some of the monuments of Anglophone historiography dealing with similar questions in this period, we could put around as contextual markers Pocock's Machiavellian Moment in 1975, Hedley Ball's Anarchical Society in 1977, which has a very similar account of the dissolution of universalist empire into particular states and their interactions with each other, and of course Quentin Skinner's Foundations of Modern Political Thought in 1979, with which Foucault's account shares many switching points and indeed chronologies and indeed a definition of the state as something distinct, abstract, territorialized, emerging out of a world of princes, but also, of course, republics in Skinner's account as well. That's just to suggest some point d'appui, at least from the Anglosphere, where we might orientate, not suggesting remotely, of course, any connection. There's no evidence that Pocock, Ball, or Skinner were remotely aware of what Foucault was doing, either in print or certainly, of course, in speech in this period, nor is there very much evidence, of course, from Foucault's own footnotes that he was interacting with very much, if anything, in the English language at this point. So I would just end with one brief speculation which relates to those points of contact as well. Where is Thomas? Where is Thomas Hobbes? We remember that in Society Must Be Defended, he's very keen to push both Machiavelli and Hobbes off the stage. Machiavelli, like nature, returns into this account, even to be expelled again in some sense. Machiavelli not as a theorist of government or governmentality, but Hobbes has almost completely disappeared. I think of him as like the Cheshire Cat in this account. Just the smile is left, but it's the smile of the Hobbesian sovereign holding the sword in one hand, but of course the crozier, the shepherd's crook, the image of the pastorate in the other. Can we smuggle Hobbes back in to put him back into dialogue with Foucault, or must he stay in the wings? I'd be sad if he did, but I'd understand if others thought that he should stay there.
Thank you. I wanted to start by thanking Bernard and Jesus and the entire team for putting on this incredible series of events, which for those of us who've had the privilege of being here over several weeks, of months now, have a kind of accumulated layer upon layer of commentary and discussion. And I, in writing and then rewriting the comments and thinking over the weekend, was put in mind, first of all, of my intense conversation with Jeremy, which has been going on now for months, and on the other hand, of Alondra Nelson's rather telling comment, which was that for a certain generation of us, reading Foucault was like returning to a comfort blanket. And it was something that we'd sort of clung to at a certain stage in our lives. I have to say, though, that thinking about this, my own relationship to Foucault is rather more intense than that, I'd say, than a comfort blanket, because reading STP, I'm reminded of how I fell in love with Foucault, I think. How I developed a much more powerful attraction than simply a dependence on a comfort blanket. And it's that attraction and that ease, particularly of the Foucault of STP, that I kind of want to wrestle with a little bit, and will wrestle with at the end of my brief comments today. But first of all, I think before we get to the critique and the analysis, it's worth simply remarking on the extraordinary virtuosity of these lectures. I mean, if these are not a book, they are kind of genius improvisation. You know, it's like the Cologne concerts or something like that, a kind of extraordinary, several month-long, meandering, Baroque improvisation. It reminds me of a kind of harpsichord improvisation in that manner. These extraordinary kind of trajectories where we start in the Baroque period, the Renaissance, move the way forward through the wars of religion, Louis XIV's absolutism, and then on and always with the horizon of the French Revolution and German idealism sort of waiting in the wings, and also the endless reworking of his own text, so Discipline and Punish and Order of Things sort of ghost through these lectures. Then the amazing sort of cameo analyses, the cameo is not the right word really, but the sustained several weeks discussion on the early history of Christianity and the pastoral regime to which it gave rise, and the counter-conduct that provoked, or for me, the absolutely powerfully influential discussion of the way in which the word oikos, the management of the household, moved to become, in the form of the economy, the central object of modern government. And all of this, I think, tempts us to read Foucault as a historian, as a kind of genius, a perhaps erratic, but nevertheless immensely fertile and productive historian. And how could we not? But as he himself then, as it were, stresses, and I think there's a degree of playfulness and perversity in this, but also an insistence, and it's very real, he insists he's not a historian, he's not a sociologist, and that, tongue-in-cheek, surely is not his competence, right? What he is what he's addressing himself to is philosophy, to the history and the politics of truth, more specifically. And it's this question of the politics of truth that really, I think, and this enormous reading that we're undertaking, to my mind, really allows one to see this, is the thread that runs extremely self-consciously from series to series, again and again. Remember how he began in that extraordinary series of lectures on the will to know in 1771, which are, after all, a recounting, an analysis of the emergence of the idea of truth out of the sort of gloom of the Homeric age into the light of the classical period. And 7 years later, where are we? We're back on the terrain of the order of things, trying to map out how knowledge and truth organized around a grid of intelligibility, a system of classification in the classical age was dynamized, was reorganized in a dynamic way around a series of processes imagined as naturally unfolding, something that happens between the 16th and the 19th centuries, and which involves, of course, for him, architectonically, the transformation of a universal grammar into a history of language, a biological classification, a taxonomy into a natural history, and an analytic of wealth conceived statically into what we now know, essentially, as economics. And this isn't a mere intellectual history, this is an account of the politics of truth, because underpinning these shifts, according to Foucault, what he discerns is the shifting technologies and organisation of power, organised in the classical age around the secularised sovereign monarchy, displaced by the 18th century by this logic of liberal governmentality. And it's that which is, of course, the target of STP, and it's that phrase that was first excerpted and brought into circulation in the Anglosphere by excerpted fragments of these lectures, which so grabbed our attention, and which he is unfolding in his account of the 18th century is this remarkable juxtaposition of, on the one hand, the story of discipline and discipline in punnage. In other words, the emergence of these apparatuses of the uniform and drilled army or the prison. And on the other hand, and this is, of course, the great gamble of this text, and indeed the great gamble that he's analysing, the new logic of government which pitted everything on a gamble on liberty, on the first programme of market liberalisation, indeed, which is what oddly hides behind this notion of security, is in fact a notion of gambling on something understood as risk. The first programme of market liberalisation argued for by the physiocrats in France between 1754 and 1764 in their seminal arguments for the liberalisation of the grain trade. And in the process of this, the politics of truth, the structures of truth are reconfigured. A form of knowledge like statistics goes from being the top-down knowledge of a kingdom, a zone of sovereignty, to becoming the master knowledge through which the existence of population and economy are defined and then mapped in their naturally unfolding reality, impelled not by the whim of sovereignty, but by the deep logics of labour and desire. Now, we could get into details, and it seems to me a kind of almost irresistible seduction in reading these incredible lectures. And that has been our pattern in previous sessions. And Foucault gives us a fantastically juicy set of concepts, and then we go after them week after week. And last time, of course, we had race, and how could we possibly avoid being sucked into a conversation about that? I'm hoping that today's terms, economics, statistics, and population, are perhaps a little less tempting in this respect. And I would urge us to take the opportunity that this provides to focus instead on perhaps some of the more fundamentals, perhaps not some of the right word, but basic, elementary, general elements that are at work in Foucault's text. In close discussion and indeed collaboration with Jeremy, I formulated some comments that were posted online about the significance of the movement between Society Must Be Defended and STP, and we will elaborate on those, no doubt, in discussion. But let me focus on three specific suggestions. First of all, I would love, given the company that we have here, to dig deeper into the basic mechanics of the relationship between power and knowledge. This may be, as it were, the oldest of old hats with regard to Foucault, but I think in this text, in these particular lectures, we have certain crystalline examples, and it would just be wonderful to deploy the intellectual capacity that we have in the room to get to grips with passages like that on page 109, where Foucault talks about the transformation from natural history to biology, from the analysis of wealth to political economy, from a general grammar to historical philology. In other words, the terrain of the order of things. And he says if we look for the operator that upset all these systems of knowledge and directed knowledge to the sciences of life, to labour and production, of language, then we should look to population. And then what does he mean? Not in a way that would amount to saying, finally, understanding the importance of population, the ruling classes set naturalists to work in this area, who then mutated into biologists as a result, or grammarians who were consequently transformed into philologists as their kind of instrumental ideological use dictated, or financiers who became economists. Not that way. It did not take place like this, he says, but in the following form, and this is the nugget, I think, that I would love to feel that I understood better. A constant interplay, this is how these knowledges emerged, as a constant interplay between techniques of power and their object, which gradually carves out in reality, as a field of reality, population and its specific phenomena. A whole series of objects were made visible for possible forms of knowledge on the basis of the constitution of the population as the correlate of techniques of power. In turn, because these forms of knowledge constantly carve out new objects, the population could be formed, continue and remain as the privileged correlate of modern mechanisms of power. What is this carving? And what is this field of reality out of which they're carved and then remain in? And what is this visibility that he's talking about? What does he mean if we move on to a similarly, I think, important passage on 164? What does he mean when he's talking about his method, the shift to the outside? And he says, taking the point of view of the disciplines involved, refusing to give oneself a ready-made object, be it mental illness, delinquency, or sexuality. It involved not seeking to measure institutions, practices, and knowledges in terms of the criteria and norms of an already given object. Instead, it involved grasping the movement by which a field of truth with objects of knowledge was constituted through these mobile technologies. And then, we can certainly say that madness does not exist, but this does not mean it is nothing. All in all, it was a matter of doing the opposite of what phenomenology had taught us to say and think, the phenomenology that had said roughly, madness exists, which does not mean that it is a thing. So what is going on here in these accounts of how power makes things visible that can then be made into knowledges? What does it mean that something does not exist, but is not nothing, as opposed to something which exists, but isn't a thing? What are the stakes in the arguments with phenomenology, the philosophical school that had such powerful influence on Foucault in the 1950s? This is a suggestion made to me by many of our friends, Anir Basilai, who is in the moment, as it were, excavating the intellectual history of Foucault, and insists on the centrality of this. There are pointers in Deleuze's brilliant reading of Foucault, which many of you may know, where he lays out how power mediates between the things we can see and the things we can talk about, and grasp through concepts. But for me, I would like to see this also as an opportunity to return to that moment that we confronted, sort of recoiled from with shocked horror in one of the earlier lecture series, where Foucault pounds the table and insists that his method requires going dehors du texte, outside the text, as he put it so provocatively and clearly in a direct jab at Derrida. And if we're going to push down this route, it seems to me there are two basic questions that will take up the remaining of the time that I'm going to consume this evening. If you give power this absolutely basic foundational role that Foucault is giving it, as the thing that relates what can be seen and what can be talked about, then that does shield you in some ways against Marxist reductionism, as that quote I read out a minute ago suggests. You're not going to find yourself in the position of saying the ruling class hired a bunch of intellectuals who then shape knowledges. But it opens you up to a different type of reduction, in which this amorphously, potentially all-consuming notion of power is doing all the work without itself being explained. And Foucault in STP, as in other texts, is struggling with this basic problem. He does not want to reduce everything to the one that divides into the two and becomes the prime mover of everything. He's trying to escape what he calls this circular and internal ontology of power. But at what price, and specifically what price does he pay in this text, in STP? Because this is clearly a constant challenge. And to this extent, I want to point you to what may seem like a mundane passage. It's on page 17, but for me has taken on a kind of really disturbingly central quality. Here he says, and he's setting out his method, the relations, the set of relations, or rather the set of procedures whose role is to establish, maintain, and transform mechanisms of power, are not self-generating or self-subsistent. They're not founded on themselves. Power is not founded on itself or generated by itself. It can't be, otherwise you get sucked into that ontology he doesn't want to be part of. Or we could say more simply that there are not, first of all, relations of production, and then in addition, alongside or on top of these relations, mechanisms of power that modify or disturb them, or make them more consistent, coherent, or stable. There are not family-type relationships, and then over and above them, mechanisms of power. There are not sexual relationships, with in addition, mechanisms of power. Mechanisms of power are an intrinsic part of all these relations, and in a circular way are both their effect and cause. What's more, in the different mechanisms of power intrinsic to relations of production, family relations, and sexual relations, it's possible, of course, to find lateral coordinations, hierarchical subordinations, isomorphic correspondences, technical identities, or analogies and chain effects. And out of that comes all the Baroque improvisation, figuring out all of those different relations. This allows us to undertake, and this for me is the disturbing final sentence, this allows us to undertake a logical, coherent and valid investigation of the set of these mechanisms of power and to identify what is specific about them at a given moment, for a given period, in a given field. Now this is very clear, it's crystalline indeed, but it's also oddly constrained and conventional. It's an architectonic of power that cross-cuts power with three sets of relations, relations of productions, family and sexual relations. These seem in some sense to be a kind of ground, or at least a frame. Is the list exhaustive? No other relations are mentioned. There's no reference here to complex multiplicities that Deleuze wants to invoke. It's a classical triad, and I think it's more than incidental, because if you run this over in your mind, I think you can see how it actually correlates very closely to the three regimes of power that he will focus on. Sovereignty deriving from family, descent and kinship, discipline that relates power to relations of production, work discipline, property rights and so on, and then sexual desire that drives population, demand, consumption, utilitarianism, the entire logic of population and economy. If this is the system of STP, it's both very clear-cut and remarkably closed. It also has a rather unsettling quality, a further one, which is that it is invariant with regard to history. Its articulation seems to be time-independent. Look how the passage closes. This allows us to undertake a logical investigation of these mechanisms of power and what is specific about them in a given moment, given period, given field. So there is the mechanism, the machine, and then there is history separate from it. The machine can be moved through history to a different period, to a different field, but it does not itself constitute history. We move the analytical frame back and forth from period to period in what is effectively an empty homogeneous time. So this brings me to the point that Jeremy and I think, really converged on, and we're driving at online. There are many Foucauldian accounts of history, and each implies a Foucauldian relation to that account of history. And if his project is to write the politics of truth, and the politics is historical, then this is a necessary effect of this kind of recursivity. And this is made dramatically and indeed shatteringly evident in Society Must Be Defended, as David alluded to, in which Foucault gave a stirring account of history as war. War as the object of history, what historians write about. History as riven by the contention of war, inevitably polemically sundered. And history, in fact, as a means of war, inevitably entangled in the polemic itself. Now, STP also contains an account of history, and modifying what David was saying, but basically agreeing, this also has to do with war. It's just that war has changed its role entirely between these two texts. From being an essential, inescapable thing, a bit like class conflict, it's become instead something you diagnose as a way in which the Jus Publicum Europaeum resolves its conflicts. And what we see from emerging from this is a specific notion of time in Foucault of STP, but it's not the notion of history that we saw emerging from Society Must Be Defended, but something altogether more desiccated. It's the time that emerges after salvation has disappeared from the story. It's the time that emerges after the promise of universal empire is gone with Charles V. It's the sense of a time which is just the zone in which states clash. It's the zone of Machiavellian politicking. It is perhaps, with a gesture to Weber, essentially tragic time of international relations theory, what international relations theory as realism is reified and naturalized. And the disconcerting thing is that this empty time of the raison d'etat is eerily reminiscent precisely of the empty time through which Foucault maneuvers that mechanism, that structural account of the relationship between power, sexual relations, family relations, and the relations of production. And I think this is the question that really Jeremy and I converge towards, is what sense we should make of the dominance of this anti-analytical time in STP? Is there something ominous about it, about the coolness of the tone of STP, the failure to situate himself in the conflict? Is this perhaps an overinterpretation of a loose passage? Is there, in fact, a sort of saving grace in Foucault's many inconsistencies? Or, in fact, is this a deep consistency? Indeed, a continuity with his injunction that we must be historicist, that we must understand, therefore, our own moment. Are we saying that Foucault is insisting in STP on this mode of analysis because we are still in the zone of governmentality, that we have not escaped it, that that is the mode of analysis proper to us? Are we stuck in this time? Now, that might sound like a critique, and it might be the sort of critique in which some people have argued that Foucault becomes complicit in neoliberalism. So let me add, by way of conclusion, the observation that, as far as I'm concerned at least, it may be heartbreaking, but it isn't a critique made from the position of superiority. It's rather a kind of self-questioning that was forced on me by the power of an observation that Jeremy made, that this is Foucault working inside, potentially, governmentality, inside the state. Is this, in a sense, what made the cool, quaffable quality of STP so easy for me and my generation of readers, so easy to swallow? Was what we were digesting, was it so easy for us to digest this because reading this in the 80s and 90s in Thatcher's Britain, it spoke so directly to our world in a language which seemed to be of that world and almost, as it were, identically mapped onto it?
Jeremy, please.
Thank you. Thank you to Jesus and Bernard for keeping this together all semester long. It's been just just an enormous pleasure, one of the great pleasures of coming to Columbia for me. So I sort of have already said my piece on the blog. I made full use of it, but teed up nicely by Adam. Maybe I'll just sort of try to summarize and drive home what I was getting at there. And the basic claim is that the change that we see from society must be defended to security, territory, population is not merely a change of object, but a change of methodology, and most fundamentally, a change of politics. I'm not making any claims about the longer arc of Foucault's politics or methodology. I don't know exactly how to make of the change I detect, but it seems to me that the texts sort of speak for themselves, and the change is radical. So the crucial opening move to see this radical break is to take very seriously the pathos that we see, or we saw in the first lecture of Society Must Be Defended. In that first lecture, as David mentioned, Foucault says he's going to be now turning for the next several years to the study of war, but I think it's important to recall why. The lecture begins by Foucault essentially taking a stock taking of what he's been doing for the past several years in the lectures. And this is collecting genealogies. He calls them scattered genealogies, tattered genealogies at one point. And on the one hand, Foucault seems to be quite full of pride with what has been accomplished. He is proud of what has thus far been accomplished in the work of the lectures. And he describes what has been accomplished. He describes these genealogies. He describes genealogy in a radically political and radically bellicose language. So there's just some quotes. He writes that genealogy, quote, allows us to constitute a historical knowledge of struggles and to make use of that knowledge in contemporary tactics. Genealogies are anti-sciences. Genealogies are about the insurrection of knowledges, They are an insurrection against the centralizing power effects that are bound up with the institutionalization and workings of scientific discourse organized in a society such as ours. Compared to the attempt to inscribe knowledges in the power hierarchy typical of science, genealogy is a sort of attempt to desubjugate historical knowledges, to set them free, to enable them to oppose and struggle against the coercion of a unitary, formal, and scientific theoretical discourse. And he likes that. He says, that's good. That's good what we've been doing. But then he has this worry. And just as his language describing genealogy is about tactics and about struggle, his worry about genealogy is precisely a tactical and a political worry. In that first lecture, he asks, are the subjugated knowledges we are unearthing and putting into play in the present struggle strong enough? Are the genealogies strong enough? Or will they instead be re-annexed, is the verb he uses, re-annexed or recoded is another verb he uses, by totalizing unitary discourses of science and society? And he says that there are changes in the present conjuncture that lead him to this worry that genealogy may not be a sufficient weapon in the present struggle. And he's talking about the present struggle. And that is why he then turns to war. His point being, I've been discussing genealogy in these bellicose terms. I am now worried that they are not strong enough precisely within that frame of bellicosity to resist the enemy. Many times he is the adversary. They will not be strong enough to stand up to the adversary, which is the present state of totalizing science and society. And so he says, we will turn for the next several years to war to sort of better examine whether the genealogy really is going to work, whether they will do the work we need them to do. And then we get society must be defended. And it's just an incredibly vivid and in many ways heartbreaking text. The crucial moment that I identify comes quite early on, where Foucault seems to have found a historical object in the early modern period that provides the really existing, what he calls historico-political basis for what he just described as genealogy. And this is in the discourse, the practice of counter-history, contre-histoire, and race war that he finds emerging in the early modern period. And he pairs them, counter-history, race war. If we see the way he describes the practice of counter-history and race war, it is so similar to the way he describes the practice of genealogy in the first lecture, his own practice of genealogy. What race war does is it resists philosophical juridical discourse, it disrupts it. It disrupts the discourse that ever since Greek philosophy has always worked with the assumption of a pacified universality. And race war does this because the person who is speaking in the discourse of race war, the person who is telling the truth, recounting the story, rediscovering memories, and trying not to forget anything, and here we hear the echo of recovering subjugated knowledges, is inevitably on one side or the other. The race war subject, the counter-historical subject, is involved in the battle, has adversaries, and is working toward a particular victory. So for him, what we see in counter-history/race war is an absolute partisanship, a partisanship that is political and that is epistemological and that denies the unitariness of truth and denies the totality of the state and society, both, to represent the entirety of history, of socio-political relations, of human relations of all kinds. He says about counter-history, just another quote, that counter-history is the first historical political discourse, Foucault tells us, because against the prior history, which he says from antiquity through the Middle Ages was a history of sovereignty, a history that sovereignty told about itself, about its timelessness and its endlessness, counter-history emerges to deny the unity of the city, the nation, or the state, to speak from the side that is in darkness, from within the shadows, and to speak of legitimate rights solely in order to declare war on law. This is not to critique law, or to dissolve law, or to suggest that law is not what law says it is, but to declare war on law. And in doing so, counter-history, quote, tears society apart. So what happens? So he seems to have found precisely the really existing basis of the method of genealogy that he describes in the first lecture of the course. And then what happens is, towards the end of Society Must Be Defended, we found out that counter-history lost. That during the French Revolution, the Revolutionary Party, the French bourgeoisie, performed what Foucault calls a self-dialecticalization. I don't know if it's more beautiful in French, of counter-history and of race war. And essentially what it does is it involutes counter-history and race war. It merges history with philosophy. History will now become another discourse of universality in the form of the dialectic. And it merges race war, which had originally been the discourse that denied the totality of the state and society. It merges race war with the state and society in the form of what Foucault, at the end of Society Must Be Defended, will call biological racism. And there, at the very end of the lecture, very end of that last lecture series, Foucault speaks personally. And he speaks specifically about what this history he has just recounted means as a matter of tactics, as a matter of ethics, as a matter of political choice. And what he says, sorry, I'm just finding the quote. Oh, I have it in analog form. What he says is that, this is on the very last pages of the lectures, he says, 262 to 263 of Society Must Be Defended, which I know all of you may not have. He says, he turns to another thing that has caused me problems for a long time. And it is that in socialist thought, in all socialist thought, he has been worried about this problem, which is that when socialist thought turns to the matter of a one-to-one encounter with the adversary and with the need to fight him physically, to risk one's own life, and to try to kill him, there is a need for racism. And Foucault basically identifies precisely the language that he used to describe genealogy at the beginning of Society Must Be Defended, the society of direct one-to-one struggle, the partisanship of us against the totalizing discourse of science and society. Precisely that language and that discourse, Foucault says, inescapably flirts with racist eliminationism. And this has been a problem for him for some time. I merely propose in the blog post that Foucault has solved the problem in security territory population through subjecting himself, essentially surrendering to the pacification of the historical field that he describes as happening during and after the French Revolution. As Adam said, he is within, he speaks from within the state. He speaks from within governmentality, which seems to me to be a vision of history that begins in the present moment, the present conjuncture of the totalizing science and society, and looks backward, seeing its own reflection at every instance of every prior epoch. The evidence I point to in the blog post is simply the transition, the verbal echo of counter-history in the term counter-conduct. Obviously, Foucault talks a lot about resistance in security territory population, a lot about struggle, a lot about revolt. He talks about it in terms of counter-conduct. And time and again in security territory population, Foucault makes clear that whereas counter-history was defined by its fundamental exteriority to society and the state, its denial of the totality of society and the state, Foucault makes clear time and again that counter-conduct as a method of political struggle, or perhaps of epistemological struggle, is always in dialectic with conduct, that it is never on the outside. So, for instance, the penultimate page of security territory population, I should say, and then I'll close here. He says that what had defined the old history of sovereignty was the postulate, quote, the postulate that the history of great men contains the history of lesser men, that the history of the strong is also the history of the weak. That was the postulate of the history of sovereignty that characterized antiquity in the Middle Ages. The postulate that counter-history posed in its place was that the history of some is not the history of others. And it was simply by asserting that postulate, that partisan postulate, that counter-history would tear society, could tear society apart. Here's how he describes the role that counter-conduct in his entire vision of governmentality at the end of security territory population. Quote, whether one opposes civil society to the state, the population to the state, or the nation to the state, it was in any case these elements that were in fact put to work within the genesis of the state and of the modern state. It is therefore these elements that will be at issue and serve as the stake for both the state and for what is opposed to it. To that extent, the history of raison d'etat, the history of the governmental ratio, and the history of counter-conducts opposed to it are inseparable from each other. So here we have, I would just suggest, in security territory population, a simple embrace of the totalizing logic of the history of sovereignty that Foucault had hoped genealogy, counter-history, race war might resist. It has not. And we end in this very different methodological and political place. So I'll close there.
Thank you. All right, so as this seminar has progressed and extended, it's become increasingly difficult, I think, to discipline or harness or rein in or set a structure for the conversation, because we actually have so many from previous seminars that are kind of infiltrating and whatnot. But I will try to propose a few themes, and I will be very brief. So the pacification of Foucault's thought, that line in Jeremy Kessler's comment on the blog, I think is simply brilliant and captures so much of the contemporary debate over Foucault's engagement with neoliberalism. The idea of a transformation from the bellicose Foucault, as you suggest, into the ethical Foucault is a striking idea. I would find a different word for ethical. I would find a different word than ethical, I think, or I would contest that word, since we've seen throughout the ethical nature of his political interventions and the ethical dimension of his political interventions, particularly his active political interventions. So I think we might want to find some, but there is this notion of the bellicose Foucault to some other Foucault is striking. Now, Jeremy gives some real flesh to that notion of a pacification when he proposes a shift in Foucault's approach from a counter-history in society must be defended to counter-conduct in security territory population. And this ties nicely to Adam Tooze's and David Armitage's comments. So, and together the comments raise, I think, three important questions or challenges for us. The first has to do with questions of time and space. The second has to do with the relationship, at this point I would just say, to history. I originally had thought the economy was important also, but we didn't really, I mean, that's in the blog post, Adam, but you didn't really talk about that so much here, so let's just keep it to history. And then the third is the concept of contre-conduite that is so important. So first, David Armitage raises, I think, a marvelous question that has always struck me, and to a certain extent hadn't been there until I heard your talk and read your blog post, which is really, what is the role of territory here? In those three expressions, security, territory, population, I've always been struck by the analysis of security and the analysis of population. I mean, we see in these lectures a rewriting of the order of things using the notion of population, which is really striking. Security, of course, is the basis of a new way of thinking that I believe is the kind of contemporary rationality that he is facing at the time. I mean, it is what he is, it is this new object, it is neoliberalism, it is what he is trying to understand, and it feeds seamlessly, of course, into the next year's lectures. My reading of these lectures is that he is basically trying to understand neoliberalism from the first pages of Security, Territory, Population, where the term is defined exactly using Gary Becker's notion of the economic model of crime and punishment. That's what he's exactly using as his first example, and that we ultimately get a genealogy, or we might want to call it something else, but a genealogy that brings us from the pastoral, etc., all the way back to Gary Becker at the end of Naissance de la Biopolitique. But what of territory? And so I think that insofar as our task in this seminar, at least the task that we've set ourselves, Jesus and I, is to excavate the pistes de recherche, the new ones, the places where there might have been something that wasn't possibly brought to fruition, that might have been abandoned or was never fully developed. I think that would be a really fruitful one. On the question of time, I think this connects directly to Adam Tooze's, well, actually, no, David, you brought up the question of the universals and the notion of discipline as a universal, I mean, madness as a universal, and the question then of whether discipline itself might be thought of, what the relationship between time and the notion of discipline itself, the notion of security. And so it raises, of course, the central issue of his nominalism, of Foucault's nominalism here, and its relationship to time. Now, so insofar as what we are trying to do to understand the present is to identify different ways in which power circulates through disciplinary logics and mechanisms, or through securitarian logics or mechanisms, right? We do have an ambiguous relationship to these universals and to the question of time. How to locate them and how to deploy them today, and whether we are in, and this goes, of course, to the conversation we've been having a lot about the temporality of these notions. That takes us also, of course, to the question of history, which is the second large theme here today. On the question of history, I think it's impossible not to read Foucault here in Security, Territory, Population, also somewhat in really in Security, Territory, Population, in relation to the raging controversy by the historians on discipline and punish, right? So if you look at the timing of this, okay, he is embattled with the historians at this juncture. Jacques Léonard's essay comes out in July of '77, basically, all right, which is this real frontal assault on him, how cavalier he is with history, etc. He's writing La Poussière et le Nuage at around this time because he delivers it at a huge round table of historians. So he's kind of in confrontation with the historians, which occurs in May of 1978. So just a few weeks after security territory population. So I think that we have to read this in relationship to an attack by historicists of his work. And he is on the barricades of surveiller et punir, really, in a defensive mode, right? And defensive and offensive, I mean, he's on the attack as well. But he's redefining, defending, redefining, rearticulating the place of history. This raises questions then about whether it becomes a technique that one might deploy. Is that too mechanical, perhaps, or what exactly? But I think it's very important to locate it in terms of his conversations or debates or antagonistic relations with others at this particular time, which of course then raises the question of the relationship to the notion of counter-history that he had developed. So he would have been developing after the publication of Discipline and Punish in 76, right? Okay. Now, so this brings us, I think, to the third theme for today, which is counter-conduct, which would be worth probably developing more and speaking about. Now, the important question here is whether counter-conduct is tame in a way. And Jeremy, you were kind of suggesting that there's a certain taming of Foucault that is associated with the move to counter-conduct. And so here, very, very quickly, I'm not sure that there is a taming here. And the first thing I would suggest is that he is returning to episodes of state repression through the genealogy of governmentality and creating a new historical or genealogical location of the police and the forms of policing from the 17th century, right? In a way, security territory population is providing a different genealogy that gets us to very similar places. A different genealogy going, as you know, going through the pastoral, raison d'état, but they converge at the point of policing, at the point of the most repressive elements of the state apparatuses. And so you'll see in here that he actually takes us back to the Ordonnance of 1666, the Ordonnance of 1670, through this different lens. And that makes me wonder whether, in fact, counter-conduct, which would be linked to the ratio, the reasoning gouvernemental, is necessarily so tame. Now, the notion of counter is really fascinating, and here I owe a great debt to Etienne Balibar. Jesus and I have both had the great honor and benefit of auditing his seminar this semester, since it was so close to ours, on Marx and Foucault. And Etienne emphasized the repeated use of the term counter throughout. And as he had suggested this, I started to see it crop up everywhere in Foucault's writings. You'd seen it early on in the debate with the Maoists, where he talks about contre-pouvoir, debates contre justice, of course here it's contre-histoire, contre-science, and of course there's the contre-positivisme, which plays an important role in Mal faire dire vrai, as he calls it. I would like to evoke here a contre-positivisme that is not the opposite of positivism, but rather its counterpoint. Okay, and there's hanging over us a debate over the contre-Marx or the anti-Marx. But in any event, and Etienne's argument in his seminar was that Foucault developed a contre-politique, which maybe we can get to a little bit today. But in any event, what is this contre-conduct that is so important here? and that Arnold Davidson has written a lot about. We know, of course, that the arts of governing are the conduct of conduct, he tells us, right? How does then contre-conduct fit here? This, too, I think, would be a productive theme for us to explore. Finally, although, this was the fourth thing I thought, but maybe maybe we won't have the time, but the world around us is in a vortex right now, right? The first turn of the French regional elections yesterday have created havoc in France. The events in this country are spinning out of control, with Republican presidential candidates making all kinds of comments. And, of course, our president intervening yesterday with a speech on terrorism. Chicago is exploding with police cover-ups every day. There was a new dash cam released today in a separate homicide, in a separate police shooting from October 2014, shortly before the Laquan McDonald murder. And so I would say we're in a time of turmoil, and we might want to ask, at least in part, how these research leads might enlighten our present. I personally have found that the move from state apparatuses to notions of governmentality has been particularly useful in thinking through institutions, structures that have a hold on the digital space, on our digital world. And so I tend to think of this new digital world that we live in as an amalgam of intelligence services, social media, retailers, multinationals, et cetera, that collect and mine all of them together, our data endlessly, and work together. And and there it seems to me that it's useful to use some of these concepts to think through that. But how else might these categories help us in understanding the present? So, with that, Jesus, why don't we open it up?
Let's take some comments from Jeremy wants to add something, but then let's open also the conversation, because I'm sure we are going to have a very rich one, and we still have some time.
A very quick clarification.
Yeah,
I know that whenever I watch the speaker who just spoke speak again, it fills me with such rage. So I'm aware of the risk I'm running here. But I just thought, I thought it might be helpful to offer a brief clarification about the counter-conduct and its tameness. I guess what I would suggest is the claim is not that counter-conduct is always nonviolent or does not change things, does not cause conduct to react. To me, I think that the defining whether or not counter-conduct is tame has to be understood in relationship to the question of history. And the question is not whether it is violent or nonviolent, but what can the violence accomplish? And what I would simply suggest is the violence that counter-history was purporting to accomplish was breaking the given conjunction. That is why Foucault associated it with revolution itself. It is violence that intervenes in the present conjuncture, ends that conjuncture, and begins a new one. Whereas counter-conduct cannot at a coup, at a blow, move beyond the present conjuncture. And just the quote to demonstrate a perfect example of this. Foucault on the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, which he describes as involving forms of counter-conduct. The struggle was not conducted in the form of absolute exteriority, but rather in the form of the permanent use of tactical elements that are pertinent in the anti-pastoral struggle insofar as they fall within, in a marginal way, the general horizon of Christianity. So my suggestion is that counter-conduct is tame in that it can never push beyond the present, the horizon of the given moment.
Thank you very much. We are going to be taking some comments then. Here, please, your name?
Adam Leeds, University of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
So this comment answers to the comments of the presenters as to what is Foucault's positionality in these lectures, and also where do we place these lectures within Foucault's work in this period. And when I first read these, I was really struck by the passage on 230, in which he's talking about the reactivation of the conduct. And in particular, what this passage is doing in this book is we're seeing that the pastoral concerns move to become the concerns of the state. But we also have in this one paragraph in the middle of 230, the discussion, a quick discussion about the reactivation of the problem of the conduct of the self and the reactivation of Hellenic themes of truth-telling and ethics in this very same period. And I immediately read this as this is the transition in which subsequent lecture series will take off on ethics, Greek forms of truth-telling, etc. And also Foucault placing his own practices in a genealogy that goes back to this same period of the reactivization of the conduct of the self. So I just wanted to point out this one little marker in the text as being a different way to tell the history of Foucault's work in this period, as well as speaking to these questions of Foucault's positionality.
So Foucault, please.
Oh yeah, so I think this is a comment that gets at the question of why no hops, or generally speaking, why no high intellectual history in the story except for political economy. It gets at the issue of the relationship between power and knowledge, which is something that Adam brought up. It raises the question, I think, or maybe displaces the question of depoliticization, or how Surveiller Punir is revised. And maybe it addresses the question of counterconducts, or how they seem to arise out of modes of governance. But I think if we turn to the end of, it's 49 and 50 of the French version, or it's just the end of the 18th January 1978 lecture, Foucault talks a little bit about the relationship, I think, between pouvoir and savoir in a way that kind of raises this question. And I think what he's doing there is he is engaged in a revision of his claims in Discipline and Punish, where he says, somewhere I said that you couldn't understand the place, the mise and the setting up of ideology and politics, liberal ideology and politics, without keeping in mind that the same century that claimed all these liberties, at the same time instituted disciplinary power to foreclose on them or to guarantee them. At the same time, he kind of says, well, I was wrong about that, but I wasn't altogether wrong. So there's a revision, but it's very partial, and he says that, I think in a more precise and particular way, liberty is nothing but the correlative of the mise en place, the setting up of the dispositif of security. So there he seems to be displacing his claims about, let's say, the rise of something like liberalism onto another set, but it's a set of material practices, right? The setting up of this space of circulation and exchange. And here he seems to be basically claiming, he talks about ideology and he doesn't say it doesn't matter, but he seems to present it as kind of a secondary thing that arises on the basis of this very material practice, or that is possible on its basis. So you have the setting up of this sphere of circulation and exchange, the mécanisme de sécurité, and then he says, it's not an ideology, or it's not fundamentally, it's not first of all an ideology, it's above and before that a technology of power. So he seems to be making a claim that although there's a savoir that's implicated in these relations of power of this dispositif de sécurité, it's political economy fundamentally. And that then he seems to be depicting liberal ideology as a secondary product that's possible on the basis of basically being inserted into this. So another way of reading this is that, in fact, and opens the question of depoliticization, if this isn't a kind of Foucauldian kind of ingenious reworking, for example, of Marx's claim that the sphere of circulation and exchange is the Eden of the rights of man. He seems to be basically saying that there's a kind of material substratum that renders someone, say, like Hobbes, possible. In a sense that he seems to be also kind of placing this as something that within which you can conceptualize the rise of liberal ideology, but liberal ideology is a derivative and secondary product, even if it's re-implicated in, and he says it can't, it is absolutely, I won't even deny it, liberal ideology is implicated in the setting up of capitalism, but he seems to think of that certain forms of knowledge are just possible on the basis of a certain set of material substrata. But then that raises the question, as Jeremy is talking about, of counterconducts, because he seems to be saying that in some ways the counterconduct, or an anti-liberal ideology also presumably would be kind of posterior to this setting up of the mechanisms of security. So they aren't necessarily contemporaneous, or one seems to be kind of an effect of a return. But then this raises the question of whether he's not merely continuing actually a lot of things that he was thinking when he talked about pouvoir and résistance. Because it seems like the issue of counterconduct and governmentality is just another way of continuing the problematic that was set up with pouvoir and résistance. Sometimes he certainly seems to think that resistance occurs on the basis of let's say, the ways of being and the material substrata that are set up by a certain mode of governing. So I think that this kind of brings all these things together, but I'm not entirely certain what makes this rupture vis-a-vis his earlier thinking about the nature of resistance, where he often seems to think of it as a secondary product, or something that's at least possible on this basis. Now, maybe Foucault seems to oscillate, but it seems hard not to. For example, if we talk about like decolonization, it would seem really hard to say that, there isn't some ways in which, having, let's say, elites who have at least been introduced to certain European ideas and can make sense of modern, like they can use modern European firearms and some techniques from the mass politics of Europe, is part of what makes possible decolonization. But clearly, it's not to say that all of these people and their practices are just derivative. So it seems like almost impossible for Foucault to fundamentally embrace either of the terms of this, either seeing resistance as fundamentally outside or inside.
Thank you very much, Luca. Diana?
My question kind of picks up on David's point about what is territory and what is it doing for Foucault, as well as adding another axis through which to complicate this rupture that we see between society as we defended in the current lectures, which turns on the question of periodization. And I wonder if and how much of a shift you see in the kind of periodization that he's trying to do, or what he calls himself on page 6, the kind of a historical schema. And he makes very explicit the point that actually to describe things in these ways as the archaic, ancient, modern, and contemporary misses the kind of critical important thing. And of course, the way that I think this is usually talked about is as it's understanding these relays of power through which we should not necessarily see discipline, security, and so forth as mutually exclusive different periods, but as interconnected. But I wonder if there's more work that's being done as he thinks about how to differentiate these different temporal slots, and whether this would reflect on the question of how he considers his own now, which is more than 1977, 78, but how he would place his contemporary moment or his own contemporary in relationship to periods that have preceded.
Thank you. Rosalind?
I might have lost my train of thought, but but I will try to bring it back. I mean, I worry a little bit about this tendency to read every reference to the historically prior or the determining conditions as the material substratum. I mean, that those are not the same things, I think, and they lead us to imagine that in this difficult negotiation of what is a widespread agreement across a huge array of radical thought, that there is no absolute exteriority vis-a-vis historically determined conditions or ideology. This is not Foucault's invention, so how he's thinking about that problem, I think we are tending sometimes to attribute to him a certain form of Marxism that maybe there are perhaps affinities, but not that one which would understand the determining conditions as strictly the material substratum. I think there's something else going on there. But there are the two passages that have both been invoked here I think are worth looking at insofar as the argument about that exteriority and that possible neoliberalist element and or the pacification, which I confess I wouldn't agree with. But at the end of page 49, or the last pages, the last paragraph of that lecture on page 49, what Foucault described as the improbable, the absolutely not self-evident fact of a form of government that thinks in terms of the nature of things rather than some essential evil, and that and refers to a physics of power, or a power thought of as physical action in the element of nature, and a power thought of as regulation that can only be carried out through and by reliance on the freedom of each, is, I think, something absolutely fundamental, not an ideology, or not primarily an ideology. So this thinking in terms of the freedom of each is a technology of power, and this would be one of those moments in which the description of what we might call retrospectively something that looks like neoliberalism is not, it seems to me, self-evidently a folding into that or complicity with it. So that when one gets to the end of those lectures on 356, just prior to the passage that you read, Jeremy, I mean, there's this extraordinary statement. There must be a moment when breaking all the bonds of obedience, the population will really have the right, not in juridical terms, but in terms of essential and fundamental rights, to break any bonds of obedience it has with the state, and rising up against it to say, my law, the law of my own requirements, the law of my very nature as population, the law of my basic needs, must replace the rules of obedience. Consequently, there is an eschatology that will take the form of the absolute right to revolt, to insurrection, and to breaking all the bonds of obedience, the right to revolution itself. I don't know how one makes that or assimilates that to an understanding of this, to a pacification.
By way of his reading of Stalinism.
Sorry?
By way of his reading of Stalinism.
By way of reading?
By way of his reading of Stalinism, so that just bends back.
That's not self-evident.
But yeah,
He seems to be saying, though, that formulation of a revolt is fundamentally a way of thinking in relationship to a prior mode of governmentality, and that's why he says, that these things are going to take support on that which the same state reason, raison d'etat, had finished in making appear, so that when the counterconducts inspire themselves on the basis of a population, of a civil society, and of all the other things that he sees as fundamentally being established as correlatives of this kind of mode of governance. I think that gets back at the question of the interiority, exteriority.
The determinants are not the outcomes.
yeah.
That's all.
Yes, Adam.
I mean, he even has a footnote at that passage where he explains that this isn't the standard Manichaean reading of revolutionary politics that just reads it as religious revolt gone wrong, even though it sounds an awful lot like that. I think it's that latter gesture, and this connects directly to society must be defended. As Lucas pointed out, that analysis, that section, that anatomy of the modes of counterconduct is mapped straight back on to the grid of the defining features of governmentality. And so it may have explosive effects, but I think the burden of Jeremy's argument, if it holds about society must be defended, is that they're likely to be catastrophic as a result of their imbrication within the structure of governmentality. So you're arguing presumably that there's more openness, but the historic...
No, that's not my argument. My argument is the strangeness of the gesture that would understand insurrection as right. This is the anomalous. This is there would be a right based in the conception of the population, that this would be that is the insurrection may either offer a rationale for itself or rationalize itself or not, but that it would have to speak itself in the idiom of population, but also in terms of right, is surely a strange thing. It's part of the invention that is being described here in the history of forms of oppositionality. And to construe it as right is a strange thing. Sorry, I'll stop now.
I mean, maybe you could say more about that, because I don't find it strange at all. I mean, that goes obviously back to Locke, and further back to forms of even like Christian scholasticism has a right to revolution. So the fact that Foucault recognizes that there is this development of the claim of a right to revolution, I'm not really sure what that gets one. The question is it's the transition from insisting on being a partisan, from insisting on saying whether you are participating in the revolution, and that's the only way you can do scholarship or you can do epistemological work, is to understand whether or not you are in the revolution, versus saying from a third position, here people are making claims about revolution. I mean, to me, that difference is all the difference in the world, and clearly contrast Foucault here to, say, Althusser, who is saying many of these same things. The passage Luca read is just right out of Althusser's description of ideology as it's materialized in practice and as it's functional. But the difference is that he steps away from what he seemed to be flirting with in 76, which was the idea that theory had to be partisan, that it was only true vis-a-vis one side of the struggle or the other. So, I mean, I think there's all the room in the world for describing all of political history here. The question is, what are the politics of that description?
We are going to be connected to this conversation with Etienne, Nadia?
Yeah.
Yes, and Bernard?
Yes,
Yes,
sure.
go ahead. Yes, Etienne.
I just wanted to make a
Please.
quick remark, if you allow me.
Yes.
Trying to throw something embarrassing into the conversation to make it even more complicated. I tend to believe, or I suggest, to be refuted, of course, that the test for the interpretation and the validity of the passage you've just been reading, which makes the population, whatever it is.
Not race.
Sorry?
Not a race.
Not a race, not yet a multitude. This is a different terminology that would be introduced. Certainly not a class. Not exactly a people. A something collective. So, which makes the population the agent, the subject, in fact, of a type of counter-conduct that cannot be pure and simply tamed. Let's use that category. I cannot prevent from thinking that this taming in our discussion has a Nietzschean background. I mean, it's the Zucht, it's the idea of the domestication of the... okay, so not tamed, therefore wild, somehow. Therefore performing, I will use the Blanchotian category, but I think it's never very far in Foucault's thought, an interruption in the continuity, an interruption of discontinuity. So, excuse me, that makes the population the subject of this type of counter-conduct that may be named and described by using the category right, while at the same time denying that this right should be understood in legal or even meta-legal terms, I mean natural right, if you like. Reason why I'm not entirely in agreement with your reference to Locke, but it's important, of course. So the test came with the Tehran uprising, and so. And if we say revolution, we're already in the midst of the difficulty, because as you know, Foucault was eager to write not ceci n'est pas une pipe, but ceci n'est pas une révolution. It's an uprising, etc. He was continuously looking for a terminology that would be, etc. So, I don't know at what point I will no longer be here. We'll talk about his engagement with, towards, not exactly within, but he was in the territory. I mean, he went. But I put it very brutally. I think that that led to a disappointment in Foucault's experience and thought that must have been as dramatic and devastating, I would say, as his disappointment with communism in his early years. So he had two great disappointments: communism and communism. And that doesn't mean that the idea of the counter-conduct as interruption or the radical counter-conduct, disappeared from his thought and his plans and projects, but it could no longer be collective in any politically meaningful sense. So I know this is very brutal and somewhat provocative, but
Nadia, Agnese.
Yeah, I'd like just to continue this brutality because it's very inspiring. Because it is really the lack of politics here, right? If by politics we mean a projectuality, something that is not simply against or sabotaging or destroying the ruling system or the conduct, because this is a permanent disturbance. We can break here and there, but the system goes on. And indeed, in the conclusion of the chapter Rose was reading, he says there is no independence actor here. The dependence on the state is crucial. So to that extent, the history of the raison d'etat, the history of the governmental ratio, and the history of the counter-conduct opposed to it are inseparable from each other. So there is no autonomous action here, and there is no autonomous project. Revolution is an illusion, purely an illusion. So the question we should ask ourselves, perhaps, is really more than taming. Is a limitation of possibilities for doing something, for realizing something, or I'm wrong. Perhaps I'm wrong. Yeah, but that's
something we can learn from.
That itself is a political trend.
Yeah, but imagining a city, or creating a city, or creating a new constitution, this is something that is no longer there.
That's the language game of sovereignty and totality.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the one that needs
Count.
Agnese?
I think, just aside, I think he's very much, to me it reads like he's very much within it, and reading it and within a self-reflection of what is, what possibilities does counter-conduct entail. And reading it in the context, in his contemporary context, the fact that he signed together with Sartre and Deleuze the call to French intellectuals against repression in Italy, and the course context does mention his stance on the croissant case, and so if we read he marries, no, he's denounces repression, to much state repression towards counter-conduct, violent counter-conduct, with the Red Brigades in Italy and the Red Army faction in Germany. And then he ends with a reflection on the improductivity of counter-conduct. So counter-conduct will not generate a break. It will just create, in a sense, more violence and more repression. And though I feel that he's not totally embracing as well the totalizing sovereignty, I feel that he's very much inside it, that it's the sort of internal struggle, not that he's taking an outsider position within the inside. I don't know, it's sort of Pasolini for a leftist intellectual that doesn't see counter-conduct as it is being undertaken, as it's happening at that moment as a possibility.
And then we need to come back to the order of...
Okay, yeah, so on counter-conduct, so I think that the passage that Adam Leeds pointed out to us on page 230 is really important and links then to the other essay that is somewhat contemporaneous here, which is what is critique, right? I'm sorry, this is in the English. I didn't locate it.
It's on 230 in the English?
230 in the English, yeah. And so this is, and of course it's throughout, and you were talking about it, Adam, yourself, but it's this idea of the specifically private forms of the problem of conduction, how to conduct oneself, one's child, and one's family, which brings us back to the Hellenistic period, and which also raises these questions of how to conduct oneself. Now, those are obviously the same themes and concepts that he uses in the essay, what is critique? It's about how all of the different ways in which we govern ourselves, right? And that's an essay where he talks about contre-conduite, but he also talks about voluntary inservitude, right? A pretty strong notion, voluntary inservitude. If one is wondering whether contre-conduite is necessarily a tame thing. Now, this brings us back to an issue, I think, of exteriority, but a different kind of exteriority, but it has to do with the question of whether he is going when he goes outside the state. What is he doing when he is going outside the state? And on my reading, what he's doing is what he did with the prison, which was that instead of looking at the prison and its history very narrowly defined, which would have taken us back to the Rasp House, etc., right? Instead of looking at a history of the prison, he goes outside the prison to look at discipline, the formation of discipline throughout society, to then get us to the larger level of relations of power. Here, instead of doing a history of the state, he takes us outside the state to look at the raison d'état, rationality gouvernementale, to then take us to this notion of governmentality, right? Now, the point is, of course, that the state then gets located historically, but that insofar as contre-conduite are going to be dialectically or some other way related to the rationality of the form of governmentality, we're going to be seeing different forms of contre-conduite associated with different forms of governmentality, some of which may or may not be tame. And that, I think, is the context in which, Rosalind, your passage is very important, right? In some periods, depending on the form of governmentality, it may be tame, it may not be tame, what the contre-conduite calls for, which brings us back to today, I think. Insofar as we are faced with something that so much involves, for instance, our own conduite on social media or our own conduite on Amazon.com or our purchases or our consumption, one could imagine that it might be the case today that contre-conduite must take the form of contre-consumption of some sort, which may be viewed as tame in a revolutionary sense. But if you look at Chicago today, for instance, what was putting the most pressure on the mayor was the Black Friday intervention, right? And actually, that's probably the only contre-conduite that's going to achieve anything in Chicago is going to be something that goes to consumption, ordinary acts of consumption, that would actually be the only thing I would imagine that would put pressure on Rahm Emanuel, right? It's not going to be protest, it's not going to be violence, surely. Actually, violence, in all likelihood, would backfire, and then all of a sudden we'd be back to kind of the rhetoric of the importance of policing and order. But it would only be closing down the economy, at which point, I think, the people who are in positions of financial support would be able to say, you know, Rahm, it's time for you to step down, right? So that, I think, so contre-conduite has to be located historically, but I think that that's what he's doing by placing the state historically within the whole concept of governmentality.
Yes. I guess my question is probably for all three speakers and Foucault talks a lot about the relation of forces and problem of dynamics, and also physics of power that Ross earlier referred to. And I find it fascinating, exactly what is he getting at. I would like to have a more precise understanding of this before we could move on to talk about contre-conduite and these other, or revolt. Could I ask you to focus on March 22nd, that lecture? And it's fascinating. With my volume, the translations, page 295. On the bottom, this long paragraph, he says, this new theoretical and analytical strata, this new element of political reason is force. It's force, the force of states. We enter a politics whose principal object will be the employment and calculation of forces. And then the following sentence, politics, political science, encounters the problem of dynamics. And he goes on to elaborate on a physics, and he mentions Leibniz. He says of these, everybody was talking about this at that time, and it doesn't matter in what area, science, physics, and he says he is not going to speculate whether they are related or not. But all of a sudden, something appeared where everybody is talking about forces. And then the next page, if we skip one passage, and I'm really intrigued by this one passage, he says, let's summarize all this. The real problem of this new governmental rationality is not, therefore, just the preservation of the state within a general order, so much as the preservation of a relation of forces. What is he getting at? It is the preservation, maintenance, or development of dynamic of forces. And he's getting at the nature of the political reason here. And later he will tell us there are three instruments. One being a different kind of war, understanding of war. It's not a war of rights, it's a war of states, right? And then secondly, this new thing called diplomatic instrument. And finally, permanent military, what is it? He doesn't say it's military apparatus, specifically dispositif, right? This is only of the three instruments. This is where he uses dispositif, right? Okay, so this is very interesting. So what he's proposing here, there are two great assemblages. One that emerge in Western societies, and he says. Now, all based on the rationalization of forces. Now, and then he says a military diplomatic apparatus on the one hand, and the apparatus of police in the sense the word had at the time on the other. What essentially did they have to ensure? So this is how he brings the two together, understanding of dynamic forces. I wonder if you have any reflections on this. It's certainly not I mean, there's some physics here. He mentions physics, but he doesn't go into it. So I wanted to know what's going on here.
Adam, you want to answer this question or address it? David?
Yeah,
in Germany?
What he's, I think if you follow through those passages, which I find extremely interesting in the way that you do, Lydia, he comes to the idea of Europe. Where did the idea of Europe emerge from? How was it based upon the balance of power in the 18th century? He has the extremely conventional genealogy back to Westphalia, of course, but then he drives that forward to 1945 as well, and has that extraordinary passage in the middle of Germany, 304. Europe is the way of making Germany forget the empire. And then the anecdote a page later with the German plenipotentiary in 1871 arguing that Thiers, who are you fighting against? We no longer have an army, no one can resist you, France is exhausted, the Commune was the final blow against any possibility of resistance, so against whom are you waging war? The answer comes, Louis XIV. This is a history of the present, going back to the balance of power, the Treaty of Westphalia, the play of forces, and so when he's elaborating on that idea of force and dynamics, he immediately segues into the passage about the balance of power and the dynamics, almost Newtonian dynamics behind that idea as a foundation for the idea of Europe, and then kind of exits stage right, having just revealed that, and then moves on at the end of the lecture.
I mean, I take this to be an absolutely pivotal moment in the neutralisation, right? Because what's happening here is that protean force of war in society must be defended, which demands that you take position, is being translated into the basic operations of power political stock-taking. And force, which then in the analytic of Marxism, for instance, will have this absolutely central significance, is being related back, as David's saying, to a very conventional account of the emergence of a certain sort of post-Christian, secularized space of power and power politics, which I think he's getting from Friedrich Meinecke, who appears in one of the original footnotes, and is a sort of classic German account of the space for history, this particular kind of disenchanted history, and this particular kind of amoral force that emerges at this particular moment. And so in this operation in which history and war are going to change shape, and in which the struggle that is so central in society must be defended is going to become an analytic or something, an object, as it were, produced by the apparatus of the understanding of the mechanics of power. This is an extraordinarily crucial moment, and then he shows, as it were, how the implication of that is not just understandable in the space of a single state, but can only be understood within a state system. But that, I think, is one of the crucial moments in the production of this emptier space of history, against which and on the basis of which then all of those forms of counter-conduct have, as it were, to assert themselves, because the substance of the claim they're making in each case, as he makes clear at the end in that passage that Rosalind was citing, is the insertion of a more meaningful history into this empty time on which the logic of force operates.
No, I would just add, I mean, given this wonderful Louis XIV passage, so on the one hand, and linking this to the Poisson affair as a form of counter-conduct, and Bernard's point about neoliberalism being at stake from the beginning. So I don't think the issue, in the way that Adam just suggested, I don't think the issue should be posed about these lectures and the next lectures, as they have so often been posed. Is Foucault a neoliberal? Is he complicit in neoliberalism? The stakes are so much higher than that. Is Foucault complicit in teleology and a belief in the absolute end of history? And when you have this passage here about Germany, where Ranke gets the last word about oh, you people think that we won't wage war, we can wage war through the state system. I mean, this is in the context, as Agnese mentioned, where, as the course context tells us, Deleuze and Guattari in 1977 will describe the German Federal Republic as a country in conditioned to export its judicial, political, and formative model and to become the skilled organizer of repression and brainwashing in other states. And Foucault was asked to sign another letter supporting Poisson, which called Germany a fascist state. At this time, to be fair, the Chancellor of Germany is Helmut Schmidt, who, among other things, superintended the show trials of the officers who attempted to assassinate Hitler. Foucault says no. And in 1979, in Birth of Biopolitics, will write, the German model is not the model of the Bismarckian state becoming Hitlerian that is so often discussed, dismissed, held in contempt, and loathed. The German model that is spreading, which is part of our actuality, structures it and picks it out according to its real contours. This German model is the possibility of a neoliberal governmentality. So to me, this represents that those who want to issue a leftist critique of Foucault, it's not that he is a neoliberal, it is so much greater than that. It is that he believes in this absolutely inescapable historical trajectory, as Nadia suggested.
We have one person here. Can you tell us your name, please?
I'm Ted Furtick from Yale. I wanted to also ask a question to speak to the very last pages of the text that some of us wrote through upon, taking Jeremy's point that the method is politics always in Foucault. The threshold of the end of the 18th to the beginning of the 19th century, I think we all know, occupies a crucial place in his thought. From the order of things, there's the unforgettable line at the end about Cuvier, Bach, and Kant and Hegel, and only those who cannot read would fail to appreciate that he learned about the significance of that epochal break, not just from Kant and Hegel, but from all these other discourses. And so it's interesting then that the French Revolution reappears at the very end of the text, along with nationalism for the first time. And what struck me as strange throughout this whole text is that he seems to creep up to the threshold but never say the phrase popular sovereignty. And this strikes me as strange because his concept of population, which seems a real analytic breakthrough in this text, would seem so perfectly, were he a dialectician, to re-emerge as something like popular sovereignty, that if the state or some sort of governmental apparatus creates this object which is population, which bears some relationship to actual people, that those people would then, in a dialectical way, re-emerge or announce themselves as subject of history in the form of the people. So if it's true that he, as Jeremy has been suggesting, is looking back from our present to the 18th century and seeing us stuck in a regime of governmentality, does this not mean that 1800 is no longer an ethical break? And given that popular sovereignty seems to me to be the term that's being suppressed here, is Foucault suggesting in some way that democracy or something like it is not an available resource in a historical structure? And I just think maybe echoing what Jeremy just put out there.
Thank you, Ted. John?
Yes.
Well, I agree that it's very interesting to look at what's being written by Foucault in the same years. And I agree with Bernard, this debate with the historians that's published on the title L'Impossible de Prison. Unfortunately, in English it's called Questions of Method, but it was this incredible debate. And in that discussion with those historians is where he has many of the passages that Adam has drawn attention to about, I'm not an economist, I'm really interested in the politics of truth. So that's a kind of key passage. And I agree with Etienne. If you read an essay called Is It Useless to Revolt? Se soulever, I think it is in French, Is It Useless to Revolt? You have really a question very much like, what are counter-conducts? And it's a very interesting circumstance, and it's a very interesting answer that Foucault gives, where he says that what's going on in Iran, because it's a response to the criticism of his journalism in Iran. He says that what's going on in Iran, there is no model. It's a bad idea to think that revolution, the word revolution is not a good word because it suggests that it belongs to the revolutionary model that descends from the French Revolution and then goes into the Russian Revolution. It's something else, and we have to understand it as, and it's hard for him to find the words. Is it a revolt? Is it if you read on, I guess it's March 1, the section on counter-conduct, I think what's really interesting in that, of course, it has a very specific historical focus because it's about counter-conduct in a particular period having to do with pastoral power and so forth. But I think what's really interesting is that he also can't find the words to say what these counterparts are. And he dissidence, disobedience, and so dissidence, a very interesting word. Foucault's interest in anti-Soviet dissidence, what happens therefore to the French Revolution when it goes there, if you look at it from the point of view of dissidence and so forth. I think part of this. And maybe a little bit of a remark about this problem of not having a model when there's an interruption or I don't know, insurrection or a moment. It's singular, to use Foucault's terms, because we don't know yet how to classify it. I think the domesticized, it comes really when we put something singular in our insurrection back into a model, and in particular in this case, the model of revolution. It's very clear in that text. Do we have the right to revolt? So the other remark about the different things he tries out to describe counter-contexts, the word dissident, he also uses the word disobedience, very interesting, and submission, the one that you quoted, voluntary, and servitude, very interesting. What? Refusal. Refusal. Yeah, so there's a collection of things he can't really decide. I think one thing that's interesting about those, if you look at civil disobedience, if you look at Soviet dissidents, you see that they're very much involved with the politics of truth. civil disobedience in the U.S. And its relationship to Gandhi and so forth. It's called the force of truth. When you go to a bus and you step into the bus, that's the truth in the way Foucault was using. And in Soviet dissidents, Havel, all the stuff you see, quite a bit about this problem of truth and so forth. So I think those, if you can try to combine those two things, I agree with Etienne. This passage in Iran is very complicated. I think it has to do in part with the fact that the model of revolution itself, after and in the period that Foucault was interested in, was occurring outside Europe, and outside, therefore, the European model of revolution, which was the French Revolution. And you see it with the Cultural Revolution in China, and he has quite a bit to say about this. And we know how much Maoism and the Cultural Revolution was part of the Group for Information on Prisons, first thing. And second, in this Iranian case, where he talks about political spirituality. That's the passages that Michel Foucault draws attention to. But what's political spirituality? It's, I think Foucault was amazed that you could have a religious mass movement that would overthrow a regime without any act of violence. And I think he thought that that was unthinkable in Europe. So we have to ask ourselves, what has happened in modern Europe such that we no longer have the possibility that we see in this Iranian case? And this, I think, is part of this larger and international situation which Foucault found himself in that was outside of Europe. So it's interesting also that after this period, one of the features of Discipline and Punish and those early works and The Order of Things and so forth is how much they're centered, if not in France, then in Europe. But we see in the works after this period that he abandons or qualifies, or he wants to go back, he wants to look at Greece in another way, he has to rethink Christianity and all these other kinds of things. And I think this is part of this larger thing. Anyway, it's a set of reflections maybe that intersect with, I don't know, the topics that were brought up from another point of view.
Yeah, how to connect. Now we're sitting next to one another, we can figure it out. But because I actually, this is related, but I was very interested. Some of the most interesting comments were at the very beginning when the questions of space and time were raised, and the kind of anomaly of territory was pointed out, I think, by several speakers, and maybe to ask, okay, what is the work, let's say, of this kind of diagram of territory that is provided? It's in the middle. I think probably the most vivid is in the bit 341 in the English on 5th April, where he talks about what does the police do? What did the police do historically? The Polizeiwissenschaft and Gittelamauer and all of this. They did town planning. And they did it not through laws, but through regulations. And so this, and then hence the next, where is it, page, regulation of individuals, territory. So already you have the idea. I think, to respond to Etienne's question, what is the population? I think the population is numbers, basically. It's not sovereign individuals. It's like a Leibnizian curve that needs to be calculated. Anyway, so then you have the town made into a sort of quasi-convent, and the realm into a sort of quasi-town, and is the great dream of the police, right? So it seems to me, this is a possible answer. It's not, let's say, an absolute answer, but it's maybe a strategic answer to the question of politics. Because I have to say, this Foucault, I have always read as a strategist. I mean, Foucault's always a strategist at some level, but there's a very particular, maybe because of these historical events that you are highlighting, in which he seems to want to go back and redraw the map. And so Deleuze's reading of Foucault is more like this, that this is a map, a remapping of the territory, literally, but also in some sense metaphorically. So in that regard, I would at least agree with the idea that this is a domestication, and it's also, there's a kind of end-of-history narrative that's coming up, but I would countervalue that. Because if there is if there's any kind of move being made here, I think it could be understood as one of counterintelligence, in which the first thing you do if you want to fight a different kind of war is you redraw the maps. And so the question here is, it is domestication because it's the rule of the oikos. It's the inversion, a kind of inside-out political topology where the site of politics, what used to be called politics, and history, i.e. the counter-histories that produced the racial struggles, have been inverted and turned inside out such that power is administration, essentially. It's what he says, regulation. It's all these little laws. So then the political question, at least one of them, it seems to me, of governmentality and neoliberalism and so on, is at some level strategically how to respond to this map. How to, he doesn't answer that as far as I can read, but he does, in a sense, imply this is a different map of politics.
We are going to have the possibility to wrap up at the end. We are limited short on time, so let's go. Can you please give us your name?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Garrett Broad. I'm a faculty member at Fordham University.
Okay.
And I have, maybe to build on Bernard's point, bringing this into the present and also this discussion of statistics, I think there's another rip from the headlines example from the last week, which is Mark Zuckerberg. And Mark Zuckerberg's decision to give 99% of his shares for this LLC that he's developing. And I think in many ways, the example of Zuckerberg is sort of neoliberal governmentality on steroids in the 21st century and speaks to many of these key issues. And so I just kind of want to offer it and speak through your themes. In terms of counterconduct, the idea here too that Zuckerberg's donation pushing back against the failures of the state as well as the non-state actors to provide something that's short of revolution but certainly a counter to the kind of way that society has operated and sort of those who have experienced inequality. All of it based on the collection of biostatistical data over time, and big data, and I think Foucault's discussion throughout these lectures of statistics as fundamental to the art of government, and then to the question of territory and where it goes here. I think he writes on page 101 talking about statistics as the science of the state, and how governmentality was held back by the connection to sovereignty and to territory initially, right? And that it was mercantilism and sort of the growing global economy at that time that was pushing things towards statistical information being used in this more dispersed regulatory governmental way. And I think we can see Zuckerberg is interested in space insofar as it's where populations exist. And where the data can tell him and other groups that he's going to be funding, these sort of counter-conduct groups around the world, in the developing world as well as in the US and elsewhere, to do this kind of work. So I just want to kind of offer Zuckerberg as this present example that I think ties together some of these governmental themes in really productive ways.
Thank you very much, Raphael.
Yeah, it was just a small final question. I was quite struck, I think it's on the lesson of the 15th of March. Oh no, hang on, sorry. I need to start on the 29th of March, the other way around. In the discussion of police, that Foucault, when he discusses police, talks about this idea that what police is there for is a question of happiness. And we talked a bit about some of the Marxist vocabulary that Foucault could have used in the past in sur savoir and sur pouvoir and all these questions. And here it's as if it were sur vivre, sur être, plus que être, something that is appropriated, that is of the order of felicity, of happiness, of well-being. And what he's doing with that when he puts that forward, and he does over 2 pages right at the end of the lesson of the 29th of March. And then also the other thing, perhaps somewhat in relation to this that we haven't really talked about, is how he treats the notion of public opinion, and how that is, he says at the end of the lesson on the 15th of March, that the work on public opinion is one of the aspects of the politics of truth in living with that. And what that means with respect to this idea of neutralization of domestication and how it works sort of with and against population as a concept, public and population.
let's take just the last question before wrapping up. No.
Yeah, so this is for Adam and maybe a little bit Jeremy on where you started, where you said, you know, this is maybe philosophy. I read it as philosophy and not as history. And I think, so this connects to my recollection of, is it true that Rousseau during the revolution was actually sort of hanging out and wasn't even participating in the revolution? And then Hölderlin writes a poem, Rousseau, Jean-Jacques. and Hölderlin writes a poem about him as a hero because, you know, he doesn't participate in the revolution. And so your thought about maybe this is philosophy then relates to your point, Rosalind, the text where he says about the population, you know, the population stands and says, my law, the law of my own requirement. I wonder who the my is. I mean, maybe he's shifting, and this is your point, I think, maybe he's shifting from my as population to my as individual. You know, maybe the being a philosopher has to be solitary, you know, and maybe that's where he's now shifting towards the ethics of the self that we will then see later, which is, you know, I give up, you know, this is it, this is world. If you want to be real, you have to go to the self within and start investigating truth there. I'm just wondering who the my law, my thing is here in the text.
So we still have some minutes. Let's give, I know, we have some minutes to finish, to wrap up here with our guests, perhaps addressing some of the questions, some of the commentaries, some of the ideas that you have been raising. And as always, you know that we can continue this conversation in the blog, etc. But why don't we give 3-4 minutes to each of our speakers, Jeremy, Adam, and David, to address some of these questions, perhaps raise other questions, etc. Jeremy.
Thank you all so much for listening to me go on with these fascinating comments and questions. I will devote my 3 or 4 minutes just to the question of 1800 that Ted raised and the relationship between population, popular sovereignty, and revolution. Where is popular sovereignty in this text? And to me, I mean, it's just quite simply answered at the end of Society Must Be Defended, where Foucault gives his account of the French Revolution and he talks about popular sovereignty there and the nation and the way in which the bourgeoisie reconfigures the idea of a nation as something that can both contend against the state and yet has a right to the state rather than overthrow the state, has a right to the state. And Foucault will therefore peg the French Revolution as the moment that gives birth to biological racism and leads directly, he says, to fascism and Stalinism. And I love Foucault, and I wanted to echo something Bernard said about the utility. And I think this is sort of what Adam was getting at in the original seduction of STP. The utility of the concept of governmentality for doing work and studying bureaucracies and studying modern society is enormous. So none of this is meant to take away from it. But it cannot be, in my mind as a historian, it cannot be emphasized enough the banality of Foucault's history of revolution. This had been written by Hannah Arendt in 1963. It is being written by Fioret at this same time. Yeah, it is embraced by the Right Frankfurt School. It's embraced by Anne Applebaum. It is the banal, modern, anti-Marxist history of revolution. And take it or leave it. It may be right, it may be wrong. The thing I would say is even if it's right, the one thing that I think methodologically I would want to deny Foucault, and I really think this is what many people resist, is I would want to deny Foucault the claim that he has escaped totality. Because he gives up revolution, as Etienne, as many people have pointed out. He says, how can you be revolution? That's totality. I'm trying to get away from totality, echoing all of these thinkers who connect revolution to totalitarianism. But that's only really great if you are not yourself a totalitarian. And in that passage that I read and that Nadia re-emphasized at the very end of the lectures, where Foucault insists upon the absolute ontological inseparability of the state and resistance to the state, that is a discourse that believes and is committed to totality as any other. So you can, his history may be right or it may be wrong, but methodologically, he also is committed to totality. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Adam?
Yes. Thank you, Ed. That adds to my embarrassment, I think. I wanted to perhaps come back to Reinhold Martin's point, which was on this issue of the way in which this remapping might relate to resistance. In fact, there's 2 points I want to make, one of which I don't really quite know how to locate, but it relates back to Jeremy and this issue of war and history. But the first one I think is more straightforward, which is that I like this idea that this is a remapping, and I think that's another way of, as it were, clearly reading the way in which people appropriated Foucault in the 80s as this crucial remapping. I just think the remapping is slightly different from the one that you suggested, just in your shorthand. And on the rereading of this, and it goes back to that passage that Luca was quoting, it strikes me ever more forcefully than before, which is precisely that these lectures mark the move away from police and discipline and all that microscopic stuff, right? And what he's saying is, I wasn't entirely wrong about that, but I was basically wrong about it. Because what I didn't grasp was how governmentality, which is this gamble on something else, shifts the entire terrain. And the difficult, the really disturbing quality of that gamble and what gives it its totalitarian, I think, kind of feel, which is the point he shares with Arendt as well, is that it's a gamble on the social, right? That the mode of governmentality is going to use, in the interests of governmental reason, all of the big aggregates, the entire apparatus of modern social science. The notion of forces, everything that we thought in the 19th century we could turn into liberatory social science is actually situated within this governmentality. Population, force, the economy, the whole works is all actually in this. And it is tied to, and this is the odd thing, at least it's got to have at least two histories, one of which is the internal empty history of the state, and the other one is Hegelianism, right, which has neutralized the force of the really explosive earlier polemical history. And it's that I really wanted to go back to, and it's this sort of vain appeal that I made today to think about the earlier French history of engagements with these problems, and it goes back to the moment of phenomenology. And I want to quote a favourite passage from a favourite essay by a favourite earlier author, which is Merleau-Ponty, "The war has taken place." And just listen to these lines. "After June of 1940, however, we really entered the war. For from then on," and that means we enter history, and a generation of French intellectuals enters history at this moment. And what does that involve? What sacrifice does that involve? "From this moment onwards, we were no longer permitted to treat the Germans we met in the street, subway or movies as human beings. If we had done so, if we had wanted to distinguish Nazis from Germans, to look for the student behind the lieutenant, the peasant or the working man beneath the soldier, they would only have had contempt for us, and that would have considered it a recognition of their government and their victory, and then they would have felt like victors." In other words, this is this crystalline formulation of this problem, but it isn't a problem of racism. Right? It's a problem of something denaturing. It's something that Merleau-Ponty and his entire generation suffer as an agony because they're engaged in this absurd way of relating to other human beings. But what's so fascinating about it is that Merleau-Ponty, as we know, doesn't bind that back into some teleology of racism that conflates Nazism and Stalinism and makes both of them the same thing by the 30s and 40s. As problematic as his relation to Stalinism is, it's nevertheless a much wider open space. And to me, this really compounds. This is precisely, presumably, Foucault's moment. This is precisely his moment of uncertainty about what the face-to-face confrontation with an enemy would involve, what denaturing is involved there, what impersonality creeps in. But this doesn't seem to me that I'm more confused than ever about why the move, well, it seems to me all more strategic than ever that move to racism takes place in Foucault, because that's really, as it were, the closing of the door then to this difficult, undeniably painful confrontation with history in its full lethal form.
Actually, just partly to pick up on that, I'd say aphoristically, and I'll just fill this out with a couple of sentences on each. Something that strikes me about the text, and it's become clearer in this discussion, is that in Foucault's historical account, war becomes externalized rather than internalized as it had been in the previous set of lectures, and externalized in a very literal, even banal sense of being pushed beyond the bounds of a Europe which is now settled on the balance of power. It's Mably's Europe des traités. It's a very conventional account of a dynamic balance of forces, again, which has been created within a Europe which has no outside. And there may be an outside, but it's vacuous, it's empty, it may be a zone of violence, but something is pushed beyond the edges. And we'll come back to discussions about the absence of the colonial throughout Foucault as well. But there's nothing beyond the boundaries of that Europe now. So war has been externalized in that sense. It's beyond the boundaries of the account here. One of the reasons, I'm coming back to my own question here, that Hobbes is not here is that Hobbes has been internalized. A very important part of the Hobbesian project, as Hobbes described it, is the transformation of a multitude, that is of individuals, into a populace, something which can be the bearer of popular sovereignty, for instance, fundamentally, but something which also can then be represented through the Leviathan. So there's a sense here that Foucault is not just seeing like a state, but he's seeing like Leviathan. He's seeing like Thomas Hobbes. He doesn't have to elaborate all of that. The process, the historical process that, in a sense, he is going through in his own elaboration of the lectures is precisely that transformation of the multitudo into the populace, the individuals into something that can be surveilled and policed in that way. And so we end up with a history which is very like Hobbes's vision of history, bounded states interacting with each other in a posture of balanced forces of hostility, like gladiators. There's no outside to that, beyond that zone of peace, which could collapse at any moment. So he's not just, again, seeing like a state, he's seeing very like Thomas Hobbes in that way. And that might account partly for some of the banality of his history. I think that's a very good way of putting it. I wonder, this is very, very speculative and probably heretical in this setting. But I think coming back to the point about the querelle against the historians in 76, is he actually in some ways on the defensive? Is he deliberately banal in his account of European history, in particular, as a defensive move against the courage of discipline and punishment? I've always, as a historian, thought that Discipline and Punish is his greatest work of counter-history. It bears the same relation to history as Nietzsche's genealogy bears to philology, very deliberately subversive. And I wonder if he's pulling back here to very conventional narratives, especially of the formation of Europe and the European state system, its long-term consequences into the 19th and 20th century, as a partly defensive crouch against that. And maybe, I mean, to counter that, the stunning account, which we haven't really talked about, of the pastorate, is his attempt to go back to that kind of devastating, critical, playful, ironic, illuminating, astonishing, historical work, in inverted commas. But we leave that hanging.
Do you want to wrap up?
No.
Okay, wonderful. And thank you very much, everybody.